The light of ancient candles flickers across parchment in a dimly lit workshop, casting long shadows across the scattered instruments of art, science, and inquiry. The year is 1452, and in the small Tuscan village of Vinci, a child is born who would one day be revered as perhaps the greatest embodiment of Renaissance genius the world has ever known. But for now, he is simply an illegitimate son, born to a peasant woman and a notary, his future unwritten, his potential like a seed beneath winter soil. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance man whose insatiable curiosity about the workings of our world would transcend centuries and inspire generations. As our tale unfolds tonight, dear listener, allow your mind to drift like Leonardo's own imagination, untethered, boundless, and ever searching for the mysteries hidden within the fabric of existence. Let the gentle rhythm of this history lull you toward peaceful slumber as we explore the life of a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be understood. The young Leonardo grew up in the rolling hills of Tuscany, his keen eyes observing the flight of birds, the flow of water, the play of light and shadow across the landscape. As a child, he walked woodland paths, collecting specimens, oddly shaped rocks, delicate insect wings, fallen feathers, treasures to be examined and understood. It was said that he could stare for hours at the patterns formed by clouds or the ripples in a stream, his mind already seeking the mathematical principles that govern such natural wonders. At 14, this promising youth was apprenticed to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, where the foundations of his artistic education would be laid upon the sturdy traditions of the past. Yet, even as an apprentice, Leonardo's brilliance could not be contained by convention. A story persists that when the master Verrocchio asked his young pupil to paint an angel in the corner of his baptism of Christ, Leonardo's work was so superior that the older artist vowed never to paint again, humbled by the effortless genius of his student. As twilight shadows lengthen across your room, imagine the bustling workshops of 15th-century Florence, where apprentices ground pigments, stretched canvases, and mixed paints, while Leonardo quietly revolutionized their world with his understanding of perspective, anatomy, and light. His notebooks began to fill with drawings, ideas, and questions, thousands of pages of observations written in his distinctive mirror script, flowing from right to left as though his thoughts were too urgent, too numerous to be constrained by conventional writing. By his 30s, Leonardo had established himself in Milan under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, undertaking commissions that ranged from magnificent court portraits to elaborate festival designs. It was here that he would begin work on one of history's most recognizable masterpieces, The Last Supper, a fresco that captured the dramatic moment of Christ revealing his betrayal. Yet true to his experimental nature, Leonardo rejected traditional fresco techniques, instead using an experimental method that allowed him more time to perfect his vision, but would ultimately cause the work to begin deteriorating within his own lifetime, a poignant metaphor for the impermanence that haunted this seeker of eternal truths. But painting was merely one facet of the jewel that was Leonardo's intellect. His mind soared through the clouds on designs for flying machines, dove beneath the waves with sketches of breathing apparatus, and peered inside the human form through meticulous anatomical studies performed by candlelight on bodies procured from hospitals. He designed weapons of war while dreaming of peace, sketched water engineering projects while contemplating the cosmic scale of stars, and filled thousands of pages with ideas that would not be realized for centuries to come. As your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, consider the profound loneliness that may have accompanied such a mind. A man who saw connections invisible to his contemporaries, who conceptualized helicopters, tanks, and solar power 400 years before their time. Leonardo lived in a world that was not yet ready for his visions, carrying the burden of insights that could not yet be fully understood or implemented. The pinnacle of Leonardo's artistic achievement came with the painting of La Gioconda, the Mona Lisa, a portrait so revolutionary in its psychological depth and technical execution that it remains one of humanity's most studied and celebrated creations. With subtle modeling of light and shadow, his famous sfumato technique, Leonardo created a smile that seems to shift and change with the viewer's perspective, a living moment captured for eternity on a wood panel smaller than one might expect for such a monumental work. Yet for all his brilliance, Leonardo was human, subject to the same frailties that touch us all. He struggled with focus, leaving many works unfinished as his attention darted to new ideas and projects. His perfectionism paralyzed him, as no execution could match the ideal vision in his mind. And as the years passed, he grew increasingly aware of time's swift current carrying him toward the end that awaits us all. In his final years, Leonardo found patronage with the French king Francis I, who provided him with a comfortable home at Clos-Lucé, near the royal residence at Amboise. There, the aging master continued his studies and reflections, his right hand now partially paralyzed, yet his mind still ranging freely across the realms of knowledge. It was said that the king visited him regularly, deeply respectful of the elderly genius who had changed how humanity perceived its world. On May 2, 1519, with the spring blossoms opening outside his window, Leonardo da Vinci closed his eyes for the final time, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire and challenge humanity for centuries to come. His vast collection of notebooks, containing over 13,000 pages of notes and drawings, would be scattered after his death, many lost to time, others rediscovered centuries later, each page a window into one of history's most extraordinary minds. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, consider the paradox of Leonardo's life, a man whose greatest works were known to all, yet whose deepest thoughts remained hidden in private notebooks, written backward, undeciphered until long after his death. A man who saw the fundamental connections between art and science, between observation and understanding, between the microcosm of a water droplet and the macrocosm of celestial mechanics. What dreams might visit us tonight, inspired by such a life? Perhaps we too might glimpse, if only briefly, the world through Leonardo's eyes, a place of wonder and possibility, where beauty and truth are merely different expressions of the same sublime reality. Perhaps in our dreams, we might fly on his imagined wings, or understand as he did that learning never exhausts the mind. 5 centuries after his passing, Leonardo's questions continue to echo through our civilization, reminding us that true genius lies not in having all the answers, but in never ceasing to wonder. His life stands as testimony to the power of observation, the marriage of art and science, and the boundless potential of human creativity. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your night be filled with the gentle wisdom of history's greatest polymath, a man who knew that to truly see the world, one must observe it with both the precise measurement of science and the sensitive soul of an artist. In the peaceful darkness behind your closed eyes, perhaps you too might discover, as Leonardo wrote, that once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return. A century slides into another as the autumn leaves of the 19th century fall, giving way to the winter of a new era, where art would be reborn through the hands of a child whose first cry pierced the midnight air of southern Spain. The year is 1881, and in the ancient port city of Malaga, a boy is born to a professor of art and a mother who would whisper to him that greatness awaited. His name would become synonymous with artistic revolution, his work a testament to the transformative power of seeing the world not as it appears, but as it might be reimagined. This is the story of Pablo Picasso, the man who would break art apart only to reassemble it in his own vision, leaving an indelible mark on the canvas of human creativity. As you settle more deeply into your pillow tonight, dear listener, allow yourself to journey through the life of a man who lived nearly a century, whose artistic periods reflected the metamorphosis of his soul as he navigated love and loss, war and peace, tradition and rebellion. Let the rhythm of this tale carry you toward the shores of slumber as we explore life painted in shades of blue melancholy and rose-tinted passion. Pablo Ruiz Picasso showed remarkable talent from his earliest years, his hands seeming to understand the language of form and line before he could fully articulate his thoughts. The story goes that his first word was piz, short for lápiz, the Spanish word for pencil, as though art would be his first and truest language. His father, Don José Ruiz y Blasco, a traditional art instructor and curator, recognized the prodigy before him, and, by the time the boy was 13, the elder Picasso reportedly handed his son his own brushes and palette, declaring that Pablo had already surpassed him. The young artist's formal education proved inadequate to contain his burgeoning talent. At the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid, Pablo chafed against the conservative techniques being taught, often skipping classes to wander through the Prado Museum instead, studying the masters on his own terms, El Greco, Velázquez, and Goya speaking to him across the centuries in the hushed galleries. Even then, tradition was something to be absorbed and then transcended, never merely followed. Imagine the narrow cobblestone streets of Barcelona at the turn of the century, where the 19-year-old Picasso found community at the Café Els Quatre Gats, his early works already displaying the technical brilliance that would underpin even his most abstract future creations. Here, among fellow artists and intellectuals, the foundations were laid for a career that would span nearly 8 decades of restless innovation. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, picture Paris in 1904, where Picasso has settled in the dilapidated building known as the Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre. These were his blue period years, when poverty and the suicide of his friend Carlos Casagemas cast a cerulean shadow over his palette. His canvases from this time depict gaunt figures, beggars, prisoners, and the destitute, each rendered in shades of blue that seemed to capture the very temperature of melancholy itself. Colors, like features, follow the changes of the emotions, he would later say. His art always a barometer of his inner weather. As fortune and romance brightened his circumstances, Picasso's palette warmed into his rose period, with harlequins, acrobats, and circus performers painted in tender pinks and soft oranges. His art, like life itself, moved in cycles of renewal and reinvention. But it was in 1907 that Picasso would create the work that would herald a seismic shift in Western art. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a painting of 5 nude women, whose angular, mask-like faces and fragmented forms announced the birth of Cubism. Working closely with Georges Braque, Picasso developed this revolutionary approach that would demolish the Renaissance tradition of single-point perspective, which had dominated art for 500 years. Instead of depicting objects from a single viewpoint, Cubism presented multiple perspectives simultaneously, fracturing reality into geometric forms that revealed the underlying structure beneath appearances. "I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them," Picasso explained, challenging viewers to reconsider the very nature of perception itself. As the world descended into the chaos of the First World War, Picasso's art continued to evolve, incorporating collage elements and found objects, bits of newspaper, wallpaper, rope, expanding the vocabulary of what art could include. By the 1920s, as your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, envision Picasso's return to more classical forms. His monumental figures, reminiscent of ancient sculptures, yet unmistakably modern in their execution. The 1930s brought turmoil to Spain and to Picasso's art. When the small Basque town of Guernica was bombed during the Spanish Civil War, Picasso responded with perhaps his most powerful political statement, the massive monochromatic painting, Guernica. Its contorted figures and screaming horses capturing the horror of modern warfare in a composition as fractured as the society it depicted. "Painting is not done to decorate apartments," he declared. "It is an instrument of war against brutality and darkness." Through the Second World War, Picasso remained in Paris during the Nazi occupation, forbidden to exhibit but continuing to create in quiet defiance. His studio became a form of resistance, each canvas an affirmation of creativity against destruction. When a German officer saw a photograph of Guernica in Picasso's apartment and asked, "Did you do that?" the artist famously replied, "No, you did." The post-war years found Picasso settling in the south of France, entering a period of tremendous productivity despite his advancing age. The Mediterranean light seemed to infuse his work with renewed vigor as he explored ceramics, printmaking, and sculpture with the same inventiveness he had brought to painting. His personal life remained tumultuous. Marriages, affairs, children, his relationships with women as complex and sometimes troubling as their representations in his art. In his final decades, as mortality cast its lengthening shadow, Picasso painted with an almost desperate urgency, as though racing against time itself. His late works, often depicting the artist and model, bullfights, or musketeers, possess a raw, direct quality, the hand of the master still evident, but now freed from any need to prove his virtuosity. "It takes a long time to become young," he once said, his late style recapturing something of the directness of childhood while containing the wisdom of his 90-plus years. On April 8, 1973, in his villa in Mugens, France, Pablo Picasso closed his eyes for the final time, leaving behind a body of work estimated at over 50 zero pieces, paintings, sculptures, ceramics, drawings, prints, a testament to a creativity that never dimmed, never rested, never accepted that art had boundaries that could not be crossed. His final words were reported to be, "Drink to me, drink to my health, you know I can't drink anymore." As sleep begins to embrace you now, consider the paradox of Picasso's legacy, how an artist who so thoroughly disrupted tradition has himself become part of the canon. His once revolutionary vision now so deeply absorbed into our visual vocabulary that we see the world differently because of him. What is more radical than changing how humanity perceives reality itself? What might we learn from a life so thoroughly dedicated to creation? Perhaps it is that growth requires the courage to destroy what came before, That authentic expression demands we continually shed our old skins. As Picasso himself observed, every act of creation is first an act of destruction. A half-century after his passing, Picasso's work continues to challenge and inspire, reminding us that art, at its most powerful, does not merely reflect the world, but reimagines it. His life stands as testament to the possibility of perpetual reinvention, the refusal to be defined by past achievements, and the fundamental human drive to create meaning from chaos. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your night be filled with the colorful fragments of a world seen through cubist eyes, a world where perspective is multiple, truth is subjective, and beauty can be found even in the broken pieces. In the peaceful darkness behind your closed eyes, perhaps you too might discover, as Picasso insisted, that everything you can imagine is real. Beneath the muted skies of the Dutch countryside, where windmills turned slowly against gray horizons, and the scent of rain hung perpetually in the air, a child was born exactly 1 year after the stillbirth of his parents' first son, bearing the same name as if destined to live 2 lives in one brief span. The year was 1853, and in the modest home of a Protestant minister in the village of Zundert, Netherlands, Vincent van Gogh drew his first breath, a boy who would one day translate the invisible currents of emotion into visible swirls of color, yet who would walk through life largely unseen himself until after he had departed from it. This is the story of a man whose paintings now command millions, but who sold just 1 during his lifetime, whose letters reveal a soul of profound sensitivity and intelligence in painful contrast to the caricature of madness that so often defines him in popular imagination. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, dear listener, allow yourself to journey through a life that burned with uncommon intensity, a flame that flickered frequently against the winds of misfortune, but illuminated our world with a light entirely its own. Let the rhythm of this tale carry you toward peaceful slumber as we explore the brief, brilliant life of Vincent van Gogh. Young Vincent grew up in the shadow of the church, his father's sermons on salvation and damnation forming the earliest architecture of his worldview. A serious, sensitive child, he wandered the countryside, developing early the keen eye for nature that would later infuse his canvases with such vitality. At 16, he joined the art dealership Goupil Chie, his uncle's firm, where the seeds of his artistic education were planted among the paintings he handled but did not yet create. These early years as an art dealer took Vincent to London and Paris, exposing him to masterworks that would silently inform his later genius. Yet commercial success eluded him, his awkward manner and intense moral convictions increasingly at odds with the superficial world of art sales. "I am not an adventurer by choice," he would later write to his beloved brother Theo, "but by fate." Dismissed from the art firm at 23, Vincent embarked on a series of failed vocations as a teacher, a bookseller, and then following his father's path into religious work, first in England and later among the impoverished coal miners of Belgium. It was here, in the Borinage mining region, that Vincent gave away his possessions to the suffering workers, sleeping on straw and living in voluntary poverty until his concerned parents intervened. The church authorities, disturbed by his extreme asceticism, dismissed him from his position. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine the turning point in this wandering life, when at the age of 27, after a decade of false starts, Vincent finally embraced his true calling. "I want to make drawings that touch some people," he wrote to Theo, who would support him financially and emotionally for the rest of his days. an act of fraternal devotion that allowed Vincent's art to exist at all. Self-taught and beginning far later than most artists of his era, Vincent worked with feverish determination to master his craft. His early drawings and paintings from the Netherlands period reveal a somber palette of earth tones, depicting peasants and laborers with a dignity that reflected his deep sympathy for the working poor. The Potato Eaters, his first major work, captured a family of farmers around their humble dinner table, rendered in dark, muddy colors that spoke of soil and struggle. In 1886, Vincent arrived in Paris, where his brother Theo introduced him to the Impressionists, whose bright colors and experimental techniques would transform his art forever. Studying with Fernand Cormon, befriending artists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Émile Bernard, and Paul Gauguin, Vincent absorbed the new theories of color and light that were revolutionizing French painting. His palette lightened dramatically, the dark earth tones of his Dutch period giving way to the luminous hues that would become his signature. 2 years later, seeking the clear light and vibrant colors of the South, Vincent moved to Arles in Provence. It was here, in just 15 months of extraordinary creativity, that he created many of his most beloved masterpieces: sunflowers erupting with yellow vitality, night skies spiraling with stars, blossoming orchards, and golden wheat fields rippling in the wind. "The sun here is overwhelming," he wrote to Theo. "One can't help but become a bit of a different painter." As your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, envision Vincent in the throes of artistic ecstasy, sometimes painting for days with little food or rest. Driven by a vision he struggled to fully capture. "I put my heart and soul into my work," he wrote, "and have lost my mind in the process." In Arles, Vincent rented the now famous Yellow House, dreaming of establishing an artist colony where creators could live and work in community. He persuaded Paul Gauguin to join him, but their personalities clashed violently. Vincent emotional and impulsive, Gauguin cold and calculating. Their brief cohabitation ended in the infamous incident where Vincent, in a state of psychological crisis, threatened Gauguin with a razor before turning it on himself, cutting off a portion of his own ear. This first major breakdown led to Vincent's voluntary commitment to the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where he would spend a year creating some of his most emotionally charged works between episodes of mental distress. The swirling cypress trees, olive groves, and wheat fields he painted from the asylum windows and gardens seemed to vibrate with an inner turbulence, as if the canvas itself could barely contain the intensity of his vision. "I often think that the night is more alive and more richly colored than the day," he observed, his art increasingly exploring the borderlands between perception and emotion. In May 1890, Vincent left the asylum for Auvers-sur-Oise, near Paris, where he could be under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, while remaining close to his brother Theo. In just 70 days, he produced an astonishing 75 paintings, working with a desperate urgency, as if sensing his time was running short. The church at Auvers, the town hall, the garden of the doctor, and the undulating wheat fields appeared on his canvases, rendered with a vitality that belied his deteriorating mental state. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into one of those same wheat fields with a small revolver and shot himself in the chest. He managed to return to his room at the Ravoux Inn, where he lingered for 2 days before dying in Theo's arms, uttering his final words, "The sadness will last forever." He was 37 years old. Theo, devastated by his brother's death, fell ill himself and died just 6 months later. The two brothers, now resting side by side in the cemetery at Auvers. But in a twist that Vincent himself could never have foreseen, Theo's widow Johanna devoted herself to preserving and promoting Vincent's work, organizing exhibitions and publishing his letters. Gradually, the world began to recognize the genius it had ignored, until the paintings once deemed worthless became among the most cherished and valuable in history. As sleep begins to embrace you now, consider the profound irony of Van Gogh's legacy. How an artist who longed so desperately for connection and understanding in life achieved it so abundantly after death. His paintings, once rejected, now hang in the world's most prestigious museums, reproduced on countless posters, coffee mugs, and T-shirts. His distinctive style recognized even by those who know little of art history. What might we learn from a life so filled with suffering, yet so committed to beauty? Perhaps it is that the act of creation itself can be a form of redemption, that the transformation of pain into art offers a kind of transcendence. I feel that there is nothing more truly artistic than to love people, Vincent once wrote, his compassion extending beyond his personal torment to illuminate the dignity in every subject he painted. A century and more after his passing, Van Gogh's work continues to move us with its emotional honesty and visual intensity, reminding us that true vision sees beyond mere appearances to the pulsing heart of things. His life stands as testament to the possibility of finding meaning through creative expression even in the midst of profound isolation and mental anguish. Snow fell gently over the small Norwegian village of Oralsbrück as winter clasped the landscape in its cold embrace, and in a modest physician's home, a child entered a world already shadowed by the specter of illness and death. The year was 1863, and Edvard Munch drew his first breath in a country where the darkness of winter seemed to stretch endlessly, where the boundary between the living and the spectral remained curiously thin, a fitting birthplace for the artist who would one day paint the collective anxieties of the modern age. Born to a deeply religious military doctor and his wife, young Edvard's earliest memories would be formed against a backdrop of his father's fervent pietism and the recurring illnesses that plagued his family. This is the story of a man who would transform his personal anguish into universal images so powerful that one, a simple figure on a bridge, mouth open in a primal cry, would become an icon of existential dread recognized across cultures and generations. As you settle more deeply into your pillow tonight, dear listener, allow yourself to journey through the life of an artist who peered unflinchingly into the abyss of human suffering and emerged with visions that would forever change how we visualize inner torment. Let the gentle rhythm of this tale carry you toward peaceful slumber as we explore the haunted landscapes of Edvard Munch's life and art. Tragedy arrived early in young Edvard's life, casting long shadows that would never fully recede. When he was just 5 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis, leaving 5 children in the care of their father, whose religious obsessions and melancholic temperament provided little emotional warmth. Disease and insanity were the black angels that guarded my cradle, Munch would later write. His childhood memories tinged with the hushed whispers of illness and the somber pronouncements of sin and damnation that filled his father's house. 9 years after losing his mother, young Edvard watched as his beloved sister Sophie, just 15, succumbed to the same disease that had claimed their mother. This loss would haunt him profoundly, later emerging in his painting, The Sick Child, a work he would revisit in 6 different versions throughout his life, as though compelled to return to this moment of anguish. When I paint a landscape, he once observed, I remember that it was red. I paint a memory of the color. the color of my mood. As a teenager, Munch showed early talent for drawing, and despite his father's disapproval, enrolled in technical school to study engineering, where his aptitude for mathematics might have led him down a very different path. But the call of art proved stronger, and by age 17, he abandoned these studies to pursue painting, entering the Royal School of Art and Design in Christiania, now Oslo. There, under the tutelage of naturalist painters, he learned traditional techniques but soon found himself drawn to the more radical currents beginning to stir in European art. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine the young artist in his 20s, traveling to Paris, where the Impressionists were revolutionizing painting with their emphasis on light and momentary sensation. Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries, Munch was less interested in the external play of light than in the internal landscape of emotion. "I do not paint what I see," he declared, "but what I saw," suggesting that memory and feeling, not optical reality, formed the true subject of his art. The death of his father in 1889 marked another turning point, plunging Munch into an emotional crisis that coincided with a period of intense artistic experimentation. Moving between Paris, Berlin, and Norway, he began to develop the distinctive style that would define his mature work: simplified forms, undulating lines, and expressive distortions that conveyed psychological states rather than physical appearances. "Art comes from joy and pain," he wrote in his journal, "but mostly from pain." It was during this period, in the early 1890s, that Munch began work on what would become his most ambitious project, The Frieze of Life, a series of paintings exploring the themes of love, anxiety, and death. Central to this cycle was the work that would become his most iconic image, the Scream, first created in 1893. The painting depicts a figure on a bridge, hands pressed against its face in an oval of horror, while the landscape seems to ripple with the same distress. The boundary between self and world dissolved in a moment of pure existential panic. As your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, consider how Munch described the experience that inspired this masterpiece. "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I felt a breath of sadness. I stood still, deathly tired. Above the blue-black fjord and city hung clouds of dripping, rippling blood," my friends went on. "I remained behind, shivering with anxiety. I felt the great scream in nature." The personal demons that fueled Munch's creativity also tormented his private life. Relationships with women proved particularly fraught, his intense attachments often ending in jealousy and despair. His affair with Tula Larsen concluded dramatically when, during an argument, a gun was fired, leaving Munch with an injured finger that he would later immortalize in a self-portrait. These tumultuous relationships inspired some of his most powerful works, including Madonna, Vampire, and Ashes, paintings that depict love as a consuming, often destructive force. By the early 1900s, Munch's international reputation was growing, but his mental health was deteriorating. Alcoholism, anxiety, and paranoia led to a nervous breakdown in 1908, prompting him to seek treatment at a Danish clinic. The therapy proved beneficial, and upon his release, his work showed subtle shifts. Brighter colors began to appear in his palette, and scenes of workers and bathers suggested a newfound appreciation for the vitality of ordinary life. Returning to Norway, Munch purchased a property at Ikeli, outside Oslo, where he would live in increasing isolation for the remaining 3 decades of his life. Though never entirely free from his psychological struggles, he found a measure of peace in this rural setting, painting the changing seasons and continuing to explore the themes that had always preoccupied him, now with the added dimension of aging and the contemplation of his own mortality. When the Nazis occupied Norway during World War II, the elderly artist, whose work had been labeled degenerate by Hitler's regime, lived in constant fear that his paintings would be confiscated. He hid his works throughout his property, determined to protect the legacy he would leave behind. On January 23, 1944, as winter once again held Norway in its grasp, Edvard Munch died peacefully in his sleep at Eekli, having just turned 80. In death, Munch proved as generous as he had been tormented in life. He bequeathed his entire estate, including over 10 paintings, 500 drawings, and 18 prints, to the city of Oslo. This extraordinary gift formed the core of the Munch Museum, ensuring that the work born from his suffering would continue to speak to generations yet unborn. As sleep begins to embrace you now, consider the paradox of Munch's legacy, how art that depicts such profound anxiety can provide viewers with catharsis, how images of isolation can create connection across time and culture. From my rotting body flowers shall grow, Munch once wrote, and I am in them, and that is eternity. What might we learn from a life so marked by suffering, yet so creatively fertile? Perhaps it is that our darkest experiences need not destroy us but can be transformed through expression into something that illuminates the human condition. Munch's art reminds us that we are not alone in our fears, that the interior landscapes of anxiety and dread that we navigate are shared territory. 8 decades after his passing, Munch's work continues to resonate with viewers who recognize in his undulating lines and haunted faces something of their own unspoken terrors. His life stands as testament to the redemptive power of art, not to cure or erase suffering, but to give it form and meaning, to transform private anguish into universal communication. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your night be peaceful, even as you carry with you the knowledge that Munch has gifted us, that our anxieties, given shape and color, lose something of their power to terrify. In the quiet darkness behind your closed eyes, perhaps you too might discover, as Munch wrote, that nature is not only all that is visible to the eye, it also includes the inner pictures of the soul. The warm Tuscan sun bathed the ancient stones of Caprese as the Renaissance quietly awakened across the Italian peninsula, a golden age of art and knowledge blossoming from the soil of medieval Europe. The year was 1475, and in the shadow of the mountains, a child was born to a minor local magistrate, and his wife, a boy whose hands would one day wrest sublime figures from unyielding marble and paint divine judgment across the ceiling of a sacred chapel. This child, christened Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, entered a world still recovering from the Black Death, where classical knowledge was being rediscovered and where the human form, long shrouded in medieval modesty, was reclaiming its rightful place as the measure of all things. This is the story of the man who would be called Il Divino, the Divine One, whose works would define an era and whose name would become synonymous with the very notion of artistic genius. As you settle more deeply into your pillow tonight, dear listener, allow yourself to journey through the life of an artist whose work still draws gasps of wonder 5 centuries after his passing. Let the gentle rhythm of this tale carry you toward peaceful slumber, as we explore the triumphs and struggles of Michelangelo, a man whose creative fire burned with uncommon intensity through a remarkably long life. Michelangelo's childhood took an unexpected turn when his mother died when he was only 6 years old. Sent to live with a stonecutter's family in Settignano, the young boy absorbed the fundamentals of working with hammer and chisel before he could even read properly, the dust of the quarries entering his blood, as he would later claim. His father, Lodovico, had aspirations for his son to pursue a respectable profession, but Michelangelo's artistic inclinations proved impossible to suppress. "If you had wings," his father once admonished him, "you wouldn't know where to nest." Against his father's wishes, at the age of 13, Michelangelo secured an apprenticeship in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's most respected fresco painters. There, the precocious youth quickly mastered the techniques of drawing and painting, reportedly correcting his master's own work and earning both admiration and resentment from his peers. Within a year, his talent caught the attention of Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence and great patron of Renaissance arts and learning. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine the adolescent Michelangelo living in the Medici palace, surrounded by classical sculptures and the leading philosophers, poets, and artists of the day. Here, under Lorenzo's patronage, he studied ancient sculpture in the Medici gardens, absorbing the ideals of classical beauty while simultaneously receiving a humanist education alongside the Medici children. This extraordinary opportunity ended abruptly with Lorenzo's death in 1492, sending Michelangelo back to his father's home as political turmoil gripped Florence. The young artist's path led him first to Bologna and then to Rome, where, at the age of 24, he carved his first masterpiece, the Pietà. This exquisite marble sculpture depicting the Virgin Mary cradling the dead Christ established Michelangelo's reputation as an artist of exceptional skill and emotional depth. The details reveal his mastery: Christ's limp body gracefully draped across his mother's lap, the intricate folds of Mary's garments, and her youthful face reflecting theological conceptions of her purity rather than historical accuracy. So proud was he of this achievement, and so concerned about receiving proper credit, that Michelangelo did something unprecedented. He carved his name across Mary's sash, the only work he ever signed. Returning to Florence in 1501, the 26-year-old artist was commissioned to transform an enormous block of marble, previously abandoned as flawed by another sculptor, into what would become his most iconic work, David. For 3 years, Michelangelo labored on this colossal statue, carving from the rejected stone a testament to human potential and civic virtue. Standing over 14 feet tall, David was placed in the Piazza della Signoria as a symbol of Florence's republican strength against external threats, particularly those posed by the powerful Medici family who had been expelled from the city. As your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, envision the tumultuous years that followed when Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo to Rome in 1505 to design his tomb. This massive project, originally conceived with 40 statues, would haunt the artist for decades, as other commissions repeatedly interrupted his work. Chief among these interruptions was the Pope's demand that Michelangelo paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a task that the artist, who considered himself primarily a sculptor, initially resisted. For 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, Michelangelo worked largely alone on scaffolding nearly 70 feet above the chapel floor. His neck and back contorted as he painted over 300 figures across nearly 5 0 square feet of ceiling. Contrary to popular belief, he did not lie on his back but stood upright, tilting his head backward to paint, the physical strain matched only by the conceptual ambition of depicting biblical history from the creation to the flood, surrounded by prophets, sibyls, and the ancestors of Christ. "I am not in the right place," he wrote to a friend during this period. "I am not a painter." The completion of the Sistine ceiling only intensified demands on Michelangelo's talents. Popes and princes sought his services for tombs, chapels, and civic buildings, and though he accepted many commissions, his perfectionism and changing political circumstances left numerous projects incomplete. His relationship with his patrons was often contentious. He fled Rome when Pope Leo X, Lorenzo de' Medici's son, asked him to build a facade for the Medici church in Florence, only to be threatened with excommunication if he did not return to work. Michelangelo's mature years were marked by political turmoil that mirrored his inner conflicts. When Florence established a republic in 1527, he designed fortifications for the city, only to see the republic fall and the Medici restored to power in 1530. Fearing retribution, he hid for months until the new Medici ruler, Clement VII, offered him protection in exchange for completing the family chapel with sculptures of Medici dukes idealized in classical poses. In 1534, at the age of 59, Michelangelo left Florence for the last time, settling permanently in Rome where he would spend his final 3 decades. Here, Pope Paul III commissioned him to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, a massive fresco depicting Christ's return to judge the living and the dead. Completed in 1541, this apocalyptic vision marked a stark departure from his earlier work. Gone were the harmonious compositions and brilliant colors of the ceiling, replaced by swirling masses of figures and a palette of somber blues and reds, reflecting the artist's increasingly pessimistic worldview. These final years brought personal solace through his friendship with the noblewoman Vittoria Colonna, whose spiritual poetry inspired some of Michelangelo's own verse, and with the young nobleman Tommaso dei Cavalieri, to whom he dedicated drawings and sonnets of intense emotional attachment. Though no longer young, he took on the role of chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica at the age of 71, designing its magnificent dome that would become an enduring symbol of Rome. On February 18, 1564, just weeks before his 89th birthday, Michelangelo's extraordinary life came to an end. His nephew had his body smuggled back to Florence, where, despite his wishes for a simple burial, he was given an elaborate funeral and entombed in the Basilica of Santa Croce. The Florentines, who had often treated the irascible artist with ambivalence during his lifetime, now claimed him as their greatest son. As sleep begins to embrace you now, consider the paradoxical nature of Michelangelo's legacy. A man who could extract such graceful beauty from unyielding stone, yet described his own creative process as a painful struggle. "I saw the angel in the marble," he famously said, "and carved until I set him free." This notion of the artist not as creator but as liberator, revealing forms already existing within the material, reflects his Neoplatonic belief that beauty was not merely aesthetic, but a pathway to divine truth. What might we learn from a life so dedicated to artistic perfection? Perhaps it is that greatness demands not just talent but tremendous sacrifice. Michelangelo rarely bathed, often slept in his clothes, and frequently forgot to eat when absorbed in his work. "If people knew how hard I worked to achieve my mastery," he once said, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all. 5 centuries after his passing, the works of Michelangelo continue to move us with their power and virtuosity, setting standards that few have approached and none have surpassed. The terribilità, the awe-inspiring quality that contemporaries saw in both the man and his art, remains undiminished by time. His life stands as testament to the heights human creativity can reach when talent, opportunity, and relentless determination converge. Golden light filters through leaded glass windows in a modest Dutch home, illuminating motes of dust that dance like tiny constellations in the quiet afternoon air. The year is 1606, and in the prosperous university town of Leiden, Netherlands, a miller's son enters the world during the early years of what will later be called the Dutch Golden Age. Born to a family of comfortable means but no particular artistic heritage, this child would grow to master the mysterious alchemy that transforms humble pigments into living light and shadow, creating portraits of such psychological depth that they seem to breathe across the centuries. This is the story of Rembrandt Harmensoen van Rijn, whose name would become synonymous with the illumination of the human condition, a master whose unflinching gaze captured both the physical reality and inner spirit of all who sat before him, including, most mercilessly, himself. As you settle more deeply into your pillow tonight, dear listener, allow yourself to journey through the life of an artist who knew both extraordinary success and profound loss, whose candle burned brightly in the Dutch Republic's golden century. Let the gentle rhythm of this tale carry you toward peaceful slumber as we explore the light and shadow of Rembrandt's remarkable life. Young Rembrandt grew up in a nation newly independent and rapidly growing in wealth and cultural confidence. The Dutch Republic, having recently broken free from Spanish rule, was establishing itself as a commercial power, its merchant class building fortunes through global trade and creating a new market for art that celebrated Dutch identity and prosperity. The miller's son showed early academic promise, and at 14 was enrolled at the University of Leiden, but his passion for drawing soon outweighed scholarly pursuits. Within 2 years, he had abandoned his studies to apprentice with a local history painter, taking the first steps on a path that would lead him to immortality. After 3 years of apprenticeship in Leiden and a brief period studying in Amsterdam under the history painter Peter Lastman, the young artist returned to his hometown to establish his own studio before he had even reached the age of 20. Here, he began developing the techniques that would distinguish his work, the dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, known as chiaroscuro, the psychological intensity of his subjects, and the remarkably loose, tactile brushwork that seemed almost sculptural in its application. Early self-portraits from this period show an artist of striking confidence, with tousled hair and an intensity of gaze that suggests both ambition and self-awareness beyond his years. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to quiet, imagine the ambitious young Rembrandt in 1631, relocating to the booming metropolis of Amsterdam, a city of 130,000 souls, where ships from across the globe unloaded exotic goods along its famous canals. Here, under the patronage of the art dealer Hendrik van Uylenburg, he established himself as a portrait painter to the city's wealthy burghers, merchants, and civic leaders. Success came quickly. His ability to capture not merely a likeness, but the essence of a person brought a steady stream of commissions from Amsterdam's elite. In the Van Uylenburg household, Rembrandt met his patron's cousin, Saskia, a young woman from a respected Frisian family. Their marriage in 1634 marked the beginning of what would be, for a time, a period of personal happiness and professional triumph. Saskia's substantial dowry, combined with Rembrandt's growing income, allowed the couple to purchase an imposing house in the fashionable Briestraat, now known as Jodenbriestraat, in Amsterdam's Jewish quarter. This home, now preserved as the Rembrandt House Museum, would witness both the artist's greatest triumphs and his most crushing sorrows. As your consciousness begins to drift between wakefulness and dreams, envision Rembrandt in 1642, at the height of his powers, completing one of his most ambitious works, The Night Watch. Formerly titled The Militia Company of Captain Franz Banning Koch, this massive canvas revolutionized the genre of group portraiture through its dramatic use of light, dynamic composition, and narrative complexity. Rather than creating a static lineup of figures, as was conventional, Rembrandt captured the militia in motion, suggesting action and character through pose and expression. Though later centuries would celebrate it as a masterpiece, contemporary reactions were mixed. Some subjects complained they were insufficiently featured in the composition they had paid to be part of, a sign of Rembrandt's growing tendency to follow artistic vision over patron expectation. The year of the Night Watch also marked the beginning of Rembrandt's personal tragedy. Saskia, who had endured the heartbreak of losing 3 infants in quick succession, died shortly after giving birth to their only surviving child, Titus. Her death at just 29 years of age devastated the artist, whose grief can be sensed in the somber self-portraits that followed. The paintings from this period reveal a man confronting loss with unflinching honesty, the confident swagger of his youth, replaced by a more contemplative, inward-looking presence. The years following Saskia's death brought further complications when Rembrandt hired a widow named Geertje Durkhex as a nurse for young Titus. Their relationship became intimate, but when Rembrandt later transferred his affections to his much younger household servant, Hendrik J. Stoffels, Geertje sued him for breach of promise. The ensuing scandal damaged his reputation in Amsterdam's polite society, a community already beginning to find his artistic choices too unconventional and his lifestyle too extravagant. Despite these personal troubles, Rembrandt continued to produce works of astounding emotional and technical sophistication. His relationship with Hendrike, though never formalized in marriage due to financial restrictions in Saskia's will, brought stability and love back to his life. Hendrikje's face appears in several paintings from this period, rendered with a tenderness that speaks of deep affection. Together with Titus, they formed a new family unit, and Hendrik G. and Titus eventually established an art dealership to help manage Rembrandt's affairs as his financial situation deteriorated. The mid-1650s marked the nadir of Rembrandt's financial fortunes. His extravagant spending on art collections, rare objects, and his large house, combined with a decline in portrait commissions as tastes shifted toward a more refined, elegant style than his increasingly rough and expressive manner, left him deeply in debt. In 1656, he was forced to declare insolvency, and an inventory of his possessions was drawn up for auction. The list provides a poignant glimpse into his world: paintings by Italian masters, Japanese armor, classical busts, natural specimens, and exotic shells, the accumulated treasures of a deeply curious mind now dispersed to satisfy creditors. Rembrandt and his family were forced to move to a more modest home in a poorer district, and the artist who had once been Amsterdam's most fashionable portraitist now relied increasingly on the support of a few loyal patrons. Yet it is from this period of material decline that some of his most profoundly moving works emerge. Freed from the need to please conventional taste, his late style achieved a remarkable spiritual depth, nowhere more evident than in his series of self-portraits that unflinchingly document his aging face with compassionate objectivity. Further sorrows awaited the aging master. In 1663, Hendrik died, likely of plague, leaving Rembrandt bereft once more. His son Titus, who had become his business manager and support, married in 1668 but died within months at the age of 27, another crushing blow to the artist in his final years. Yet Rembrandt continued to paint with undiminished power, creating in these years works of transcendent humanity such as The Jewish Bride, with its tender depiction of married love, and his final self-portraits, which confront mortality with dignity and unflinching honesty. On October 4, 1669, Rembrandt van Rijn died at the age of 63 and was buried in an unmarked grave in Amsterdam's Westerkerk. His passing received little public notice. The artist, who had once commanded the highest prices in Amsterdam, died nearly destitute, survived only by his daughter-in-law and infant granddaughter. The inventory of possessions at his death was meager, listing only a few clothes and painting tools. Yet he left behind a body of work, some 300 paintings, 300 etchings, and 0 drawings, that would shape the course of Western art and grow in estimation with each passing century. As sleep begins to embrace you now, consider the extraordinary journey of this miller's son, who rose to fame and fortune only to lose almost everything except the one thing that mattered most: his authentic artistic voice. The philosopher Schopenhauer would later observe of Rembrandt's work that the greatest brightness appears only on the points struck by the most direct light. Yet one does not feel the lack of light. Rather, it appears perfectly natural. This mastery of illumination, knowing precisely where to place the light to reveal essential truth, extends beyond mere technique to a deeper metaphorical meaning. What might we learn from a life marked by such dramatic reversals of fortune, yet such unwavering artistic integrity? Perhaps it is that external circumstances, wealth, status, popular approval, matter far less than remaining true to one's inner vision. Rembrandt's late works, created when he had lost almost everything in worldly terms, achieve a profound humanity and spiritual depth that transcend the more technically brilliant but less emotionally resonant paintings of his successful years. 3.5 centuries after his passing, Rembrandt's works continue to move viewers with their psychological insight and emotional honesty. His self-portraits, forming the most extensive visual autobiography in art history, chart not only the physical changes of aging, but the interior journey of a soul confronting life's joys and sorrows with unflinching clarity. His life stands as testament to the redemptive power of creative integrity, that even through bankruptcy, scandal, and heartbreaking personal loss, the authentic expression of human experience can yield works of timeless value. So, sleep well, dear dreamer, and may your night be illuminated by the golden light that seems to emanate from within Rembrandt's canvases, a warm glow that reveals both surface and depth, the visible and the hidden. In the peaceful darkness behind your closed eyes, perhaps you too might discover, as Rembrandt knew, that sometimes it is only in shadows that the most profound truths become visible. In the still moments of the early 20th century, when the world stood on the precipice of monumental change, a child was born beneath the Catalonian sun. The year was 1904, and in the small coastal town of Figueres, Spain, a boy took his first breath, unaware that his very existence would soon bend the fabric of artistic reality. His name was not yet whispered in the grand museums of Europe, nor was it etched into the annals of surrealism. But time, that most patient curator of human achievement, would soon display his works in the most prestigious galleries of human consciousness. Salvador Domingo, Felipe Jacinto Dali, y Domenech would become known simply as Salvador Dali, the master of the melting clock, the architect of dreams made visible. As you rest now, allow your mind to wander through the landscapes of his extraordinary life, where reality and fantasy dance together in perpetual twilight. Born to a strict father and a gentle mother who believed her son was the reincarnation of her first child, who had died 9 months before Salvador's birth, young Dali grew up in the shadow of his own ghost. Perhaps it was this early proximity to the thin veil between existence and non-existence that gave him his unique perspective on reality itself. Or perhaps genius simply blossoms where it will, regardless of circumstance, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in stone. As a child, Dali displayed both remarkable artistic talent and a flair for the theatrical. He was prone to fits of rage, uncommon acts of cruelty, and episodes of intense, almost transcendent joy. His father, a notary, was pragmatic and stern, while his mother encouraged his artistic endeavors with a tenderness that fostered his creativity. It was a duality that would mark his work throughout his life, the precision of reality married to the boundless freedom of imagination. When he was only 16, tragedy befell the family when his beloved mother succumbed to breast cancer. It was a wound from which he would never fully recover, a darkness that would seep into the corners of his canvases for decades to come. Yet from grief often comes creation, and young Salvador threw himself into his art with renewed fervor. At the Madrid Academy of Arts, Dali's technical brilliance was immediately apparent, though his eccentric behavior and flamboyant appearances waxed. Upturned mustache would later become as iconic as his paintings made him stand apart from his peers. He was not content to simply master traditional techniques. He sought to revolutionize the very language of art itself. And so the stage was set for his ascension into the pantheon of artistic revolutionaries. The 1920s saw Dali experimenting with various artistic movements: Cubism, Futurism, Metaphysical, painting absorbing their essences while maintaining his distinctive voice. But it was his encounter with surrealism that would prove transformative. In Paris, he met the poet André Breton, the self-proclaimed leader of the surrealist movement, who saw in Dali a kindred spirit capable of translating the unconscious mind into visual form. It was during this period that Dali met Gala, a Russian immigrant who was married to the poet Paul Éluard. Their connection was immediate and profound. She would become his wife, muse, business manager, and the anchor to which he moored his often tempestuous psyche. "She was destined to be my Gradiva," he later wrote, referring to the mythological figure who helped the protagonist maintain his sanity. "She who advances, my victory, my wife." With Gala by his side, Dali entered the most productive and revolutionary period of his career. His method, which he called paranoiac critical, involved inducing hallucinatory states in himself to access images from his subconscious, which he would then render with photographic precision. The result was art that seemed to exist in a twilight realm between waking and dreaming, familiar yet impossible. In 1931, he painted The Persistence of Memory, with its iconic melting watches draped over barren landscapes and dead trees. The work captured the fluidity of time in dreams, the way hours can stretch like taffy or compress into mere seconds in the theater of sleep. It became his most recognized masterpiece, a visual articulation of Einstein's theory of relativity through the lens of the unconscious mind. As his fame grew, so too did his eccentricity. He gave lectures while wearing a deep-sea diving suit, claiming he needed to descend into the depths of the human psyche. He appeared on television with a pet ocelot. He designed dream sequences for Alfred Hitchcock's films and jewelry that seemed plucked from fevered visions. The world began to see him not just as an artist, but as a performance, a living work of surrealist theater. But behind the carefully constructed persona was a man haunted by fears and obsessions. He was terrified of grasshoppers, aging, and impotence. He was fascinated by Hitler, to the dismay of his surrealist colleagues, many of whom had strong left-wing sympathies. His political views and increasingly commercial endeavors led to his expulsion from the surrealist group, with Breton anagramming his name into Avita Dollars, eager for dollars. The outbreak of World War II saw Dali and Gala flee to America, where he embraced celebrity and commerce with characteristic flamboyance. He designed department store windows, painted portraits of the wealthy, appeared in advertisements, and collaborated with Walt Disney. Some critics accused him of selling out, of trading artistic integrity for fame and fortune. But perhaps in true Dalinian fashion, he was simply blurring the lines between art and life, high culture and low, sincerity and performance. In the 1940s and 50s, Dali's interest turned increasingly to science, religion, and mysticism. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki affected him deeply, leading to a period he called nuclear mysticism, where atoms, angels, and DNA helixes floated through his canvases in equal measure. He became fascinated with the mathematics of divine proportion and declared himself a devout Catholic, though his interpretation of faith was as idiosyncratic as everything else in his life. As the years passed, Dali continued to create, though some critics felt his later work lacked the revolutionary fire of his early surrealist period. He designed the Chupa Chups lollipop logo, created a tarot deck, and even ventured into holography. His creative spirit remained restless, refusing to be confined to a single medium or message. In 1982, tragedy struck when Gala, his partner of over 50 years, passed away. Dali, already in declining health, was devastated. He moved into the castle he had purchased for her in Pubal, where he was allegedly deliberately dehydrated by staff, though whether this was genuine mistreatment or an eccentric end befitting his life remains contested. Some whispered that he was attempting suicide, others that he was simply lost without his muse. On January 23, 1989, in his birthplace of Figueres, Salvador Dali drew his final breath. He was buried in the theater museum he had designed himself a fitting resting place for a man who had turned his entire existence into a work of art. His body lies beneath the stage, so visitors walking above are literally walking over Dali, a posthumous performance piece that would surely have delighted him. What are we to make of this extraordinary figure who bent reality like one of his melting watches? Was he a genius or a charlatan, a revolutionary or a reactionary? Perhaps he was all of these things, and none a paradox as surreal as his paintings. In a world that demands we define ourselves with consistency, Dali refused categorization, slipping between identities like a dream figure shifting shape. His legacy lives on not just in museums, but in our collective visual vocabulary. When we speak of something as surreal, we are invoking his world. When advertisers use dreamlike imagery to sell products, they are borrowing from his palette. When we question the nature of reality itself, we are walking paths he helped illuminate. As you drift now toward the borders of consciousness, imagine Dali's melting clocks softening the minutes and hours, releasing you from time's rigid structure. Picture the vast Catalonian landscapes of his youth, where the horizon seems to stretch into infinity. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you might meet the man with the upturned mustache, who understood that the barrier between waking and sleeping is as fluid as the paint on his canvas. For in the soft darkness of night, all of us become surrealists, navigating impossible geometries and emotional landscapes that defy logic. Salvador Dali simply had the courage and skill to bring those visions into the light of day, to make the private public, the unconscious, conscious. And in doing so, he expanded the boundaries of what art could be, what reality could contain. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that in the gallery of your mind, as in Dali's paintings, the only limit is imagination itself. The soft watches of time are melting, and the night welcomes you into its surreal embrace. In the soft golden light of the Dutch Golden Age, when merchant ships carried spices and silks across vast seas, and the Netherlands flourished in newfound prosperity, a child was born in the quiet canal city of Delft. The year was 1632, and in a modest home near the market square, a boy took his first breath, unaware that his hand would one day capture light itself and hold it, trembling and eternal, upon canvas. His name was not yet whispered in the parlors of art collectors, nor celebrated in the burgeoning galleries of Europe. But time, that most patient guardian of genius, would eventually recognize what his contemporaries largely overlooked. Johannes Vermeer, master of domestic light and quotidian beauty, creator of worlds contained within a single room. As you rest now, allow your thoughts to wander through the tranquil chambers of his life and art, where ordinary moments are rendered extraordinary through his contemplative gaze. Born to Rainier Jans, a silk worker who later became an art dealer, and Digna Baltus, young Johannes grew up in a world where art and commerce were intimately entwined. Little is known of his childhood or training, a fitting mystery for an artist whose works would later invite contemplation while revealing so little of himself. Like the quiet figures in his paintings, absorbed in their tasks beneath windows of diffuse light, Vermeer's early life remains partially in shadow. What we do know is that by his 20s, he had converted to Catholicism, a minority faith in Protestant Holland, to marry Catharina Bolens. Their union would produce 15 children, 11 of whom survived into adulthood, a domestic abundance that stands in stark contrast to the controlled, serene spaces of his canvases. Perhaps it was precisely this bustling household that inspired his artistic retreat into moments of perfect stillness, where time itself seems held in suspension. Vermeer registered with the Guild of St. Luke as a master painter in 1653, though records show no formal apprenticeship, leaving scholars to speculate on who guided his hand in those formative years. Some suggest Karel Fabricius, whose tragic death in the Delft gunpowder explosion of 1654 may have created a void that Vermeer's distinctive style would eventually fill. Others point to influences from Rembrandt's school, or even from the camera obscura, an optical device that may have informed his unusual perspectives and luminous effects. Unlike many Dutch painters of his era, who produced hundreds of works across their careers. Vermeer worked with deliberate slowness, creating only around 45 known paintings in his lifetime. Each composition was a world unto itself, meticulously observed and rendered with a jeweler's precision. This pace, perhaps dictated by his perfectionism or by the demands of supporting his large family through other means, lent each work a sense of quiet concentration, as if time had been distilled into pigment. In his early career, Vermeer painted historical and religious scenes in keeping with the highest ambitions of art in his time. Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, and Diana and her companions show a young artist grappling with grand narratives. But it was when he turned his gaze inward, to the intimate spaces of Dutch domestic life, that he found his true voice. His mature work focused on scenes of ordinary life, transformed through extraordinary attention. A woman reading a letter by a window, a geographer consulting a map in his study, a girl with a pearl earring glancing over her shoulder. These were not the gods and heroes of Renaissance art, nor the wealthy merchants who commissioned portraits to display their status. They were moments of quiet dignity in everyday existence, elevated to the sublime through Vermeer's vision. In The Milkmaid, perhaps his most beloved work, a kitchen servant pours milk with complete absorption in her task. Light streams through a window, catching the rough bread, the earthenware jug, the servant's sturdy arms. There is something almost sacred in this attention to the commonplace, a suggestion that holiness might be found not only in cathedrals but in the careful execution of daily tasks. Vermeer's mastery of light became his signature, the way sunlight filters through leaded glass windows, pools on tablecloths, gleams on pearl earrings, and softly illuminates faces turned toward its source. He achieved these effects through a technique that layered translucent glazes of paint, creating a luminosity that seems to emanate from within the canvas itself. His blues, often derived from precious lapis lazuli, possess a depth and vibrancy that still arrest the viewer's eye centuries later. Despite his evident genius, Vermeer achieved only modest success in his lifetime. He sold paintings to a small circle of collectors in Delft and The Hague, occasionally serving as an art dealer to supplement his income. Unlike his contemporary Rembrandt, he never received prestigious commissions from Amsterdam's wealthy elite, nor did he establish a significant workshop with students to expand his influence. His world remained centered on Delft, on the modest house at Oud Langendijk, where he lived with Katharina and their children, working in the front room that caught the northern light. The Franco-Dutch War that began in 1672, known in Dutch history as the Year of Disaster, brought economic catastrophe to the Netherlands. Art markets collapsed as resources were diverted to national defense. For Vermeer, with his large family and limited output, the financial strain proved insurmountable. In December 1675, at the age of 43, Johannes Vermeer fell ill and died after a brief illness, possibly a stroke brought on by stress and overwork. In a poignant testament to the financial struggles of his final years, Katharina later petitioned to declare bankruptcy, explaining that her husband had fallen into decay and decadence due to the collapse of the art market, leaving her with 11 children, many of them still young. She described how Vermeer had been unable to sell any of his art, eventually falling into such a state of anxiety that he went from being healthy to being dead in a day and a half. After his death, Vermeer's name faded from art historical records. His paintings, never numerous, were sometimes misattributed to other artists or simply forgotten in private collections. For nearly 2 centuries, the man who had captured light with such transcendent skill remained in darkness himself. It was not until the mid-19th century that Vermeer was rediscovered, championed by critics like Théophile Torreberger, who traveled Europe documenting forgotten works by the Sphinx of Delft. In an age of industrialization and social upheaval, Vermeer's quiet domestic scenes spoke to a new audience hungry for contemplation and beauty. His star has risen steadily since, with his small body of work now recognized as among the greatest treasures of Western art. Perhaps there is something fitting in this trajectory, this artist who worked in relative obscurity, who seemed content to capture fleeting moments of light and human presence without reaching for fame or fortune. Like the letter reader absorbed in distant news, or the music maker lost in the notes of her instrument, Vermeer himself appears to have been content in the act of seeing and recording, leaving the judgment of his work to a future he could not imagine. What lessons might we draw from this quiet life? This artist who found infinity in the finite spaces of Dutch interiors. Perhaps that greatness need not announce itself with trumpets and proclamations. Perhaps that beauty exists not only in the extraordinary, but in the familiar elements of daily life. A pitcher of water, a woman's concentrated gaze, the way light falls across a wall. Perhaps that patience, the willingness to look deeply at what others merely glance at, is its own form of genius. As you drift now toward sleep, imagine yourself standing in one of Vermeer's sunlit rooms. Feel the quiet that pervades these spaces, the sense of time suspended. Notice how the light touches each surface differently, the cool gleam of porcelain, the soft texture of velvet, the luminous skin of a face turned toward a window. This is Vermeer's gift to us. Across the centuries, these pockets of perfect stillness, where we might rest our hurried minds. For in our modern world of constant noise and motion, Vermeer's paintings offer a rare invitation to simply be present, to observe without judgment, to find wonder in the intimate scale of human experience. His rooms become chambers for contemplation, windows into a world where light itself seems conscious, benevolent, revealing the sacred dimension of ordinary existence. So sleep well, dear dreamer, and remember that sometimes the most profound visions come not from grand spectacles but from quiet attention to the world at hand. The soft light of Vermeer's windows falls now across your thoughts, illuminating the path to peaceful slumber. In the autumn light of 1684, as golden leaves fell across the cobblestones of Valenciennes, a child was born to a modest roof tiler in the Spanish Netherlands, a boy whose delicate hands would one day capture the fleeting beauty of life with such poignancy that, centuries later, we would still feel its gentle melancholy. This was not the birth of a king or conqueror, but of someone whose conquest would be far more enduring, that of human emotion, of ephemeral moments frozen in pigment and poetry. The child's name, inscribed in the parish register without ceremony or expectation, was Jean-Antoine Watteau. Imagine, if you will, a frail boy with observant eyes, watching the world from the shadows as traveling performers brought brief splashes of color to the gray monotony of his provincial town. His father, a hard-working man with calloused hands and practical dreams, could not understand the quiet son who preferred to sketch rather than learn a proper trade. How could he know that those charcoal smudges on scrap paper would eventually hang in palaces? That those hesitant early lines would evolve into a style so distinctive, so achingly beautiful, that art historians would later name an entire genre after his son, the Fête Galante? As a youth of 18, with little more than his innate talent and desperate ambition, Watteau made the journey to Paris, that gleaming crucible of art and culture, in the waning years of Louis XIV's reign. The city received him without notice, as it had countless other provincial dreamers before him. The grandeur of Versailles cast long shadows over France, but the Sun King's light was setting, and with it, the bombastic, formal Baroque style that had defined his era. Something new was stirring in the artistic salons and theaters of Paris, something more intimate, more delicate, more true to the complexities of human emotion. Working first as an assistant in a workshop that mass-produced religious paintings, young Watteau spent his days copying the same sacred figures over and over, his fingers learning the secrets of brushwork, even as his soul yearned for something more authentic. By night, he would venture to the theaters, where the Commedia dell'arte players from Italy wove their stories of love and longing without words. The silent pantomime of Pierrot, the graceful gestures of Columbine, these became the visual poetry that would later define his masterpieces. Watteau's rise was not meteoric but gradual, like the slow opening of a delicate bloom. His early paintings caught the eye of influential collector Pierre Crozat, whose remarkable collection of drawings by the masters became Watteau's true education. Here, among the works of Rubens and the Venetians, the young artist discovered the fluid grace and luminous color that would inform his own unique vision. As his skill grew, so too did his circle of admirers, though the artist himself remained elusive, melancholic, forever on the periphery of the very social scenes he depicted with such insight. The France that Watteau painted was one in transition. The old king had died, and the Regency period brought a loosening of the rigid court etiquette, a flowering of more intimate gatherings in idyllic settings. His canvases captured these moments, aristocrats and actors mingling in woodland settings, engaged in conversations that seem both meaningful and mysterious. Look closely at The Embarkation to Cythera, perhaps his greatest achievement. Notice how the couples prepare to depart from the island of love, their faces betraying a complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Are they arriving at love's shore or leaving it? Watteau leaves this question suspended in the golden afternoon light, just as he leaves us wondering if these perfect moments of connection can ever truly be sustained. In 1717, Watteau submitted this painting as his reception piece to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. So unique was his style that the Academy created an entirely new category for him, painter of fêtes galantes. Thus, at the height of his powers, Watteau achieved what all artists secretly desire. He had become not merely a practitioner of a style, but its originator. His vision of elegant figures in conversation against pastoral backdrops, suffused with a bitter sweetness that speaks to the transience of pleasure, had become his signature, his immortality. Yet as his art reached its zenith, Watteau's health began its decline. The tuberculosis that would eventually claim him was already stealing his breath, lending perhaps a special urgency to his work. How keenly must he have felt the ephemeral nature of beauty, how deeply understood the poignancy of fleeting moments, as he felt his own time drawing shorter with each labored breath. His productivity in these years was remarkable, as if racing against the consumption that steadily consumed him. Friends noted his increasingly reclusive nature, his tendency to begin works with passion only to lose interest, moving restlessly from patron to patron, from lodging to lodging. The same acute sensitivity that allowed him to capture subtle human emotions on canvas made everyday relationships difficult for him. While his paintings depicted the height of social refinement and connection, Watteau himself remained something of an outsider, observing but never fully participating in the elegant world he immortalized. In a final desperate attempt to restore his failing health, Watteau traveled to London in 1719 to consult with Dr. Richard Mead, a prominent physician who was also an art collector. The damp English climate only worsened his condition, and he returned to France, his body weakening even as his artistic vision remained undimmed. In his final months, he took refuge in the home of his friend, the art dealer Gersaint, for whom he painted his last masterpiece, L'Enseigne de Gersaint, a shop sign that transcended its humble purpose to become a meditation on art itself. On July 18, 1721, in a small village outside Paris, the brush fell from Jean-Antoine Watteau's hand for the final time. He was just 36 years old. The artist who had captured the exquisite pain of transience had himself become its embodiment. His body, ravaged by illness, could no longer contain the extraordinary sensitivity and vision that had given the world a new way of seeing. In the centuries that followed, Watteau's influence would ebb and flow like the tides of taste. The Rococo style he helped inspire would fall from favor during the neoclassical period, only to be rediscovered by the Romantics, who recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood that beauty is never more precious than when it is threatened by time. The Impressionists would later acknowledge their debt to his atmospheric effects and emotional resonance. Today, his paintings hang in the world's greatest museums, still emanating their quiet magic, still inviting us into conversations that began 3 centuries ago and continue in our contemplation. What can we learn from this brief, brilliant life? Perhaps that greatness need not announce itself with thunder, that lasting beauty can be conveyed in whispers. Perhaps that the most profound art emerges not from perfect happiness, but from the tension between desire and reality, between the ideal and the actual. Or maybe simply that our human connections, however fleeting or imperfect, are worth commemorating, worth rendering, in the most exquisite colors we can muster. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself walking into one of Watteau's woodland scenes. Feel the dappled sunlight on your face. Hear the rustle of silk gowns against the grass. Catch fragments of conversation that seem at once profound and playful. Notice how the trees frame the gathering like a proscenium arch, how the sky seems to deepen from azure to gold at the horizon, pulling your gaze toward some unseen destination. This is Watteau's gift to us, moments of perfect beauty preserved against time's erosion, elegiac celebrations of what it means to be briefly, gloriously alive and in communion with others.